Hello, welcome to this new session of the 8th Palava Tree within the framework of the 17th edition of the African Film Festival Tarifa Tangier. As we know, we are doing it in a hybrid mode with face-to-face session in Tarifa and a lot of online content like today. We are thankful for your assistance. We love that you are here with us on the other side of the screen. This branch for the reflection. The festival is called the Palava Tree. This is a yearly activity that we have carrying out with the Acerca program of the Spanish Agency for the International Development Cooperation. Today, we know that you are quite interested in the topic of today's roundtable. We are going to have a lovely roundtable called Anti-colonial Vision, 60 Years of African Independence. In this symbolic anniversary of the independence of many African countries, our conversation today is going to focus on reviewing facts, stories, and discourses that colonization imposed on a whole continent. We also have some films for this section. You can see them in Tarifa and some of them in our virtual channel in filming. Among them, we have Monangabe from Sara Maldoror, the storyteller par excellence of the negritude movement, a film about torture and the lack of understanding between colonized and colonizers. A story from Africa by Billy Woodberry, an animated short film called Mangi Meli Remains from Coradin Conce about the life of an African chief that lost when he was fighting against German colonization in Tanzania. And then we also have the documentary film Sankara n'est pas mort from Lucie Vivier that honors the political leader from Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara, assassinated in 1988. This film is portrayed through the eyes of Burkinabe poet Bicontin. If you follow us through YouTube Live, you can choose between English and Spanish. There's an icon that you can use on the lower part of your screens. Before introducing the speakers, just quickly, I would like to tell you that this roundtable will last 1 hour approximately, and you can participate. You can send your questions through the Q&A section of YouTube Live or in our Facebook channel, in our Facebook page. In the end of the session, there will be some minutes for these questions and answers. As you know, the seminar is being broadcasted in YouTube Live. There's a small delay in the broadcasting that is happening in Zoom. So the Q&A session in YouTube will be closed 5 minutes before of the end of this seminar that, as I said, is called Anti-colonial Vision, 60 Years of African Independence. You will see the speakers on screen shortly. We have Mbuyi Kabunda, a Congolese researcher in the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. He is also the president of the Spanish Association of Africanists. We also have Billy Woodberry with us, the director of A Story from Africa and one of the directors that led the LA Rebellion movement. We also have Lucie Vivier, the director of Sankara n'est pas mort. Sankara is not dead. This is a feature film that you can also watch in this section of the festival. It is available on filming. This conversation is going to be moderated by independent programmer and cinema historian Olivier Hadouchi. He is a researcher that has researched a lot on the independence of African country, and he is also a member of the international jury of this edition of the FCAT. Hello, Olivier. How are you? Very well. Welcome. I don't know if you have been debating a lot in the jury. We know that the 9 films that are in Hypermetropy, the competitive section of the festival. We know that these films are really good. There's a lot of quality, and I understand that it mustn't be easy to choose a winner. Well, there's always a debate. This year, there are many films, many proposals, and the debate, of course, is quite intense this year. So I'm going to give you the floor and the moderation of this roundtable with these incredible guest speakers. See you at the end of the roundtable. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be moderating this roundtable, this debate that is going to be an exchange. I'm going to make a question to each of the panelists, and then you can react to the comments of the different speakers, or if you want to give additional information, if you want to debate. Also for the participants, you can participate. I'm quite happy to be able to talk about this anti-colonial vision, 60 years of African independence. This, well, here we're going to talk about open political questions. The cinema has had an important role in the processes of independence. We have seen wars in Angola, in Algeria, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, but there are more struggles. We also need to think about Cameroon, which is something that we are not so aware of in France. There are also struggles in the long term in the field of culture. This is also an expression that for anti-colonialism, cinema has shown many internal stories, many in cultural struggles that we are going to talk about today. It's a pleasure to have Mbuyi Kabunda with us today. He's a specialist in conflicts, development, African geopolitics. He has an open, comparative approach, and he is quite well aware of the issues of migration, internal migration, South-South cooperation. It's quite interesting because many times we talk about cultural issues, but we forget that these cultural issues are linked to historical challenges. There are many debates about the negritude movement, but there is also a different background. If you allow me, I would like to pay an homage to Mr. Mbongo. He's a musician, well-known musician. He was a very important figure that also passed away. Sarah Maldoror also passed away this year. And Sarah Maldoror was a quite interesting cinematographer. She also collaborated with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. She was an important figure that passed away this year. We shouldn't spend too much time with this, but we need to remind these important figures. And this is the homage that I wanted to pay. We need to take into account that this is something which is alive. We are not going to put a parenthesis, but now we are going to give the floor to Billy Woodberry, who in 1984, he participated in Blessed Heart. He has participated in When I Die, I Won't Say Dead, a journey into the life and work of beat poet and activist Bob Kaufman. And this is a figure that we need to rediscover, a really important figure. In this case, the political issues were really important. There is another film by Billy Woodberry that, well, it is related with Marseille. Marseille is a cosmopolitan open city, which is really important. We also have a story from Africa. He was a part also of the LA rebellion movement, and he is also in contact with the Portuguese-speaking Africa, like in the case of Cabo Verde, Angola, etc. His point of view is really interesting, specifically this reuse of documents. Poets and cinematographers and historians participate in the writing of history. Lucie went to Burkina Faso at a specific time, and her point of view is quite interesting. Through the eyes of Bicontin, this poet, she shows us how society works and how to manage a heritage that has been denied many times in Africa. Many times, as we know, there are many important figures that have been forgotten and that we can recover. Forgotten in two senses. On the one hand, because they were forgotten by the imperialistic powers, and sometimes we are also talking about internal struggles, like in Senegal. We need to understand these dynamics to portray a plural story which is open and rich. These images need to be recovered, these images that have been put aside many times. This is what Billy did in A Story from Africa, recovering or these forgotten stories. We can start from a historical background. Mbuyi Kabunda, what do you think this heritage means? This heritage from the times of the independence. This would be my first question. Afterwards, there is also a question for Billy and a question for Lucie. Just to start the debate, but first of all, we need to look for an historical anchor to understand our present. Then we will talk about the past. What can we do with this heritage? What can we do with these dreams that have turned into a reality? These hopes that sometimes have turned into a disappointment. What can we do with this beautiful heritage of the African independence and the dreams of that time? Thank you, Olivier. Thank you for your question. I think it's been 60 years already since African countries became independent. After this euphoria, I remember I was a child at the moment. I remember all the songs and dances in Mikatanganatang, in my country, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There was a song saying Independence Cheta, Independence Cheta. It was extraordinary. We had Patrice Lumumba at that time. He achieved some unity not only of the Democratic Republic of Congo, but of the whole African continent. 60 years in the life of a person is a lot of time, but in the life of a state, it's a short time. But it's enough in order to make us see the balance. There was a lot of hope in the future, to have the future in our hands. After the independence of Africa, we have had good times of happiness, and in some cases, it's moments of sadness too. Moments of sadness, especially given the conflicts in the continent, conflicts which have been quite cruel, like in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in the Central Republic, African Republic, in Mozambique, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, and also different crises, economic crises that Africa has lived and which we were responsible of, for instance, in the 80s and 90s, which we consider as a lost decade. Also in 2007, 2008, this financial crisis that had an impact on Africa, given its vulnerability, given the situation of the economies, and given the structural dependence of our continent. This crisis is still having some impact today. And now we have COVID-19, which didn't come from the African continent, but from other continents in the world. Africa was able to resist. This would be the most negative side. The positive side, oh, well, there's also a negative issue that we should point out. There have been two large genocides. The last genocide in the 20th century was in Rwanda, and the first genocide in the 21st century in Darfur. These are sad stories that have had an impact on the history of the continent. We also need to look at the sunny side, like the end of apartheid in South Africa. Thanks to Mandela, we were able to finish with 350 years of domination of the white minority. On the positive side, we have also moved from the organization of the African unity to the African Union. The organization of the African unity was a regional United Nations that was in charge of peace and security. This was a decolonization organization, I would say. This was a club of the heads of state in office to be solidary in their violations of human rights. Now we have the African Union that involves the peoples a bit more, and the main goal of which is to fight poverty and to promote the political economic governance. Africans have made this really important step in their regional integration process. This can be seen clearly in the creation of a free trade area in the continent, in Africa. And this is the largest free trade area in the world. The aim of this free trade area is to increase and to boost exchanges among Africans. Lastly, we've seen the role of women. Africa is usually considered as a continent that excludes women, but we have seen in recent times that many women have started occupying important positions in central in some countries like in Liberia or Malawi, and in the parliaments like in Rwanda, where 60% of parliamentarians are women. So just quickly, Olivier, this would be the balance that we see now. Afterwards, I will make some observations and criticisms. This is a global panorama that makes me believe in the future of Africa, and which makes me be optimistic. I believe in the future of Africa. Thank you very much. Thank you for these clarifications. Now I would like to ask Billy. I would like to ask him to talk a little bit about his relation with the cultural history, about a story from Africa, and about his experience with in Marseille. His film, A Story from Africa. How did this idea came to you, Billy?
Oh, thank you. The story, I will start with the latter. I will start with a story from Africa. The story from Africa came about because I was researching another project related to another historic figure, Mario Pinto de Andrade. And I went to the Museum of Resistance and Liberation here in Lisbon. And on the 4th floor, there's an installation of material, work, photography, and images, and also writings and selections from publications, largely about poetry and other kinds of creative activities. And this first photograph that appears in the film, which is a photograph of group, it's a group photograph, photograph with two rows in the front of men who are restrained by shackles and by a wire that circles the necks of all of them and connects them. And where I misread the photograph initially because I thought it was a photograph. I just read it very quickly, visually. I just looked at it, glanced at it, and it reminded me of the same constraints and devices that had been used to restrain people during the slave era and during those, but also in other conflicts. So I assumed it was that. I didn't look very close. Then when I approached the photograph and I eventually saw the caption, and I realized that it was from 1907 and it had been taken in the south of Angola during a military campaign to pacify this region of the country. And from that, I thought, okay, maybe this photograph is really something, so maybe I can make something with it. Well, I made different attempts, and then I discovered that that photograph was from a collection that was made by a photographer who was part of the campaign to pacify different regions in Angola, in southern Angola, and in other parts of Angola from 1907, during 1907 and 1906. Learning that there were maybe 100 photographs in that, in an album that had been created that was devoted to that particular campaign. I thought maybe I could share this photograph and what I learned about it with the public. Okay, so then we started to work with the photographs and devise ways to maybe devise a kind of cinematic way of telling something about this. In the process, and reading the writings and accounts of this, first by the photographer, because in 1908 he published a book in Luanda, Angola, about this process, about the campaign in this Kumato region, and near the Kunene River, between what is Angola and Namibia, between which was then Southwest Africa, which was German, right? So he published a book, and in the book, he gives an account of some incidents that had to do, some incidents that had to do with the campaign. He gives some facts, some figures, and it's quite impressive because you learn that they go into southern Angola in 1907 in a particular way, because in 1904 they had sent a regiment with the hope of resolving and subduing the people in that region. And out of 500, 345, I think, were killed, and they never returned to Portugal. Right? So the next time they went with a much larger force, and they intended to prevail. They needed to prevail, because after the Berlin Conference and the decisions that were taken and the strictures that were laid down about how you needed to not simply claim a place, but you needed to occupy it, you needed to subdue it, you needed to survey it, you needed to, really be able to sustain your claim. Otherwise, the others would overrun and take. And you learn, I learned in the course of that, I was looking, okay, this is what is, what is obviously people would suspect he made it for the military. He was a military man. He has a particular gaze. So I think we can really think more deeply about this and what that was and when it was constituted. 1907, I'm not so sure he was so, thinking in a certain way. We attribute those things, but it's an interesting question. There's scholars who do and people criticize. But my point was, okay, most of this is from the point of view of the Portuguese, the needs of the Portuguese military and state and the project. But is there something? How do I account for? How do I understand the something of what and how the people on the other side of the process experienced and felt and thought about this? And then I discovered, it's a bad word, discover. I learned of a more complex figure and in the process. I learned, and probably for me, maybe the more important thing, without making any grand claims, is that when I saw this photograph and I saw this two lines of young men, subdued and restrained, and then above them and two lines of different African men with guns, with bandoleros, and one white man in a pith helmet with a big beard. I thought in some ways, maybe it's an image that has a kind of meaning and sort of foreshadows, or maybe it also informs us about the past. But what would happen? Those who have the weapons and the means, maybe subdue and subject the others. So it's a kind of obvious image. Maybe it can be read. It's not simply an African image, right? But it's an image that can be read in a complex way. Anyway, I learned of a figure who, for reasons that had to do with the internal relations inside the group of the African peoples that they were attempting to subdue, a figure that suggests it was not so simple, not so one-sided. We haven't always, one way of telling a story is we don't always accord the story of these peoples, even if African people, but also others. We don't suppose that they have their own internal relations, necessities, and reasons, and this thing, and that can bring people, that can create conflict. And then you have another source of conflict coming from outside, those who claim and want to dominate and decide what prevails in there. But those societies were dynamic. They had their own reasons and purpose and ideas and ways of doing things. So I found a figure who comes into conflict with the internal relations inside his own group, the Kwamato, and then for that he's expelled. They send him away. The Portuguese encounter him, realize that he has real knowledge and he's a substantial person, and so they recruit him. They incorporate him, as they don't know so much about the people that they are facing. And he agrees to this because he has his own grievance or conflict. And this leads to a very tragic thing for the individual. But I think it allows us to think about the complexity of relations, motives, and it's just as complicated as any other incident in the history of the world and figures that people have read about in different accounts, right? But I just thought that, okay, maybe this is something, even now, maybe with maybe some, that's over 100 years ago, 111 years ago, something when I undertook to do that. that it could give them, it could suggest and reassure them that the world is a very complicated place and a complex place, and human beings and the fight, the conflicts that people have been in, the struggle for the dignity and against oppression, and that takes place in a complex way. And that only, I think that's helpful maybe to remind us even today and in many instances, but to accord this experience, the complexity that it had, and to maybe think more deeply about, and we can still, I think, maybe arrive at a just position toward what happened historically, but to realize it's not so simple. And showing it with people who felt, oh, at first I thought that because maybe the way and the material that's used in the film, they have time to reflect and they have a judgment against this person when they discover one thing, that he did that. Then, and we have a way of reading and taking sides with that. And then they learn more. And then when he takes the decision to realizing the weight of whatever, why he did it, it's not exactly clear, but we see the conflict he was in. And even this simple little story suggests to people that it's really complicated. There are tragic dimensions to it. When in another period, I might have just wrote them out, okay, that's what happens, you know. But now I think maybe that's what I found, what I discovered. And the only thing I suggest, without making any grand claims, is that may be useful to people today to think about this. And I suggest probably that there must be many stories and topics and things inside in Africa. I say Africa more generally, but in many of those what are now nations and states and countries and history. There's many things to learn, to know, to show, to try to understand, and many, yes. Okay, so that's that's my thought about it. I don't know, maybe you ask me a second question. Sorry.
Non, c'était bien, non, c'est très bien, et merci pour
No, it was great. Thank you for showing us this complex vision from the historical and artistic point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to make a question to Lucie. Thank you, Billy, for this first intervention. Lucie, I would like to ask you, how was your arrival in Burkina, your film project? I don't think you knew the country, and at first, how did you discover it? How was the filming? And especially these figure, Sankara, who is not dead, according to you. Could you talk about this? Well, the film is called Sankara n'est pas mort, Sankara is not dead. This is a feature film that you can watch in the festival. And well, I didn't know, I hadn't been in Burkina Faso at all. I was not familiar with Africa. The first time I went to Burkina Faso was in 2012. A friend of mine invited me. Friendship for me was the starting point of this film. This was kind of a human seed. This journey has had a big impact on me at a personal level and also at a political level. People in Burkina, I understand that also in other countries, but in Burkina Faso, people have a political conscience, a political awareness, which is quite clear, quite lively. And they are quite passionate in the debates. This is something I liked a lot. Then I discovered the figure of Thomas Sankara. I studied history and unfortunately had never heard about him. This is a personal problem, maybe, but this shows how African political figures, their history is not taught in France. I'm talking about France because I don't know how the university system in other European countries is, but at least not in France. I also got familiar with Bicontin. He's a poet. At that time, he was writing some poems, that's true, but he was not yet a poet. He wasn't publishing anything. He was a writer, but he was not yet a published author. Well, I got along with him. He showed me his poems. I loved them. And Bicontin is a really independent person. He was he didn't go to school. He learned by himself. He has a really original way of thinking that intrigued me. We've talked a lot about Thomas Sankara. I discovered or I learned about what he did. At that time, I wasn't working in doing. I was an assistant director in fiction feature films, and then I went back to France. I didn't have a project. That was in 2012, and in 2014 there was this popular insurrection. The people in Burkina Faso went on the streets to protest, and the president was overthrown after decades in power. It's quite similar to the Arab Spring, but in this case, we are talking about sub-Saharan Africa. There has been a political transition in a short period of time. This insurrection was a peaceful insurrection, this must be said. Many Africans were in favor of this insurrection in other countries in the region. They were quite attentive to what happened in Burkina. The transition happened peacefully. There were elections which valid and internationally recognized elections. At that time, that meant a lot of hope for the population in the country and also abroad. This is the starting point for my film. I wasn't in Burkina Faso at that time, but I've talked a lot to Bicontin and other friends from Burkina Faso. We were in constant contact in the distance, and I saw how enthusiastic they were with this insurrection that brought new hopes. At the same time, I was a bit concerned because the president had been overthrown after 26 years, but now what? So the starting point of the film is now what? What is going to happen after this popular insurrection? This is a concern that I share with Bicontin. This is something that we share, and this moved us to work together and to film this story. The idea is Bicontin goes to the country by train through the only railroad in the country that arrives at Ouagadougou. The railroad between the capital and Daga is not finished yet. So the idea is how he travels across the country by rail, which is this railroad is also a heritage from the French colonization. Burkina Faso was a French colony, as we know, but the film is also related. Well, Sankara wanted to extend this railroad that had been built by the people in Burkina Faso. There is archive footage showing how the people in Burkina Faso wanted to extend this railroad. They wanted it to arrive as far as the Sahel Desert. Unfortunately, Sankara was assassinated and the works were stopped. This railroad ends up just in the middle of a forest. We tell the story of Bicantin's journey, which is linked to the history of Burkina Faso and its people. This is the starting point of our film. In order to link my film with today's debate, I would like to say that the popular insurrection in 2014, when the population in Burkina Faso went out to the streets to take the political reins of the country, this is a second independence, because of course there have been other presidents in Burkina Faso, among others Sankara, but there was a strong link with France, with the colonizing country and other Western countries through neo-colonialism. So overthrowing Blaise Compaoré meant that ending with this submission of African politics to Western countries. Thomas Sankara as well, or his memory, which is still quite alive in Burkina Faso, so the insurrection in 2014 was called Sankara's revenge. He worked a lot so that Burkina Faso would become economically, culturally, and politically independent. This was one of the main drivers of his policies. And he was also encouraging other African countries to do the same. He was encouraging his co-citizens to do the same, not only to extend the railroad network, but also to do their own textile products, to produce cotton in Burkina Faso, and to stop importing cotton.
Oui, alors, Lucie, on dirait que la communication a été interrompue. Est-ce que tu nous entends?
Well, it seems that we lost Lucie. Can you hear us at least, Lucie?
Alors, en attendant que la communication se rétablisse.
So, okay, let's wait to see if she can come back. Mbuyi Kabunda presented a precise context with many nuances, and he also talked about some contemporary issues. You are optimistic, but with some moderation. We are talking, well, if we talk about dreams, in any case, we need to have some nuances. We see that we are talking about things that we don't usually talk about. When we talk about Africa, we talk about the diaspora. So it's also interesting to see these things that we are not so familiar with, like the role of women and some other elements. Maybe this is the time to present these aspects. Maybe you can continue with your initial exposition. Thank you, Olivier, for giving me the floor. Well, it seems that Lucie is connected again. Yes, I have a connection problem. I hope that now it's working.
Termine, après, Mbuyi reprendra après la... Vas-y.
Non,
Juste,
j'étais en train.
pardon, Mbuyi. Après, vous allez reprendre tout de suite.
So we're going to give the floor to first.
Désolée pour le problème technique.
Vas-y, c'est pas grave.
Vous m'avez
My
entendu
apologies for the technical problems.
tu te rappelles, ou-
Du moment où tu parlais un petit peu
So,
comment dire des
how long?
D'accord. Ok.
Well, you were talking about Sankara's revenge.
Ça fait un moment, donc, que l'insurrection-
Yes, as I was saying,
J'étais en train de faire le lien entre
this
le
popular
thème
insurrection.
du débat d'aujourd'hui.
Well, I was making a link between my film and today's debate.
Nouvelle indépendance, quelque part, en tout cas la volonté
The popular insurrection was a new independence somehow.
avec un système politique
The will
qui
of the
était
people to break political system that
étranger, anciennement colon.
made them dependent on France and other colonizing powers. Sankara was fully committed with the full independence of his country. This was the main axis of his policies. So I was about to finish, actually. So, well, please continue.
Comme ça, vous pouvez prendre le relais si vous voulez.
Okay. Now we can make this link as well. Okay, I'm going to take the floor again. I was saying that there were some other elements that I would like to mention briefly.
Sí, uno de ellos es el problema del desarrollo.
One of them is the problem of development. After some decades of negative growth in the 70s and the 80s, now Africa, for the last 2 decades, is growing incredibly, at an incredible rate. We are even talking about the African lions. And well, this gives us hope. The growth rate of African countries is between 5 and 8% today. That is almost the same as the Asian lions. So this is the first step in the long road towards development. At the same time, I would like to underline that this is a growth without development. Why? Because growth doesn't mean distribution of wealth. This growth is happening in a context of inequalities, of lack of social justice. This is why I call this a growth without development. And this is due mainly to structural issues or contextual issues like the increase in the price of raw materials as a consequence of the high level of demand from Asian countries. Emerging countries like China, India, Brazil, etc. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the end of several wars, which is a good news in many parts of the continent, like in Ivory Coast, in Central Africa, or in the western part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also countries like Burundi and Rwanda. At the same time, we could also mention the importance of the informal sector in which young people usually work. This informal economy shows the high level of creativity of African peoples. On the other hand, we have the democratization process. After several decades of the dictatorship of military governments and some parties after the 90s, there is a movement that preceded the Arab Spring. This movement started a democratization process through the local elections and legislative national elections in almost all African countries. Now we can say that Africa is working firmly towards democracy. But there are some nuances to this idea. In some parts, we have seen some, in this context, we've seen hard democracies, that is, dictatorships that have the appearance of democracies, but the people in Africa are not willing to give up these spaces of democracy in their states. This is why we are seeing how a civil society is appearing. Lucie was mentioning this in the case of Burkina Faso. These are social movements that are fighting, that they have put in question the established powers and dictatorships like the Blaise Compaoré dictatorship in Burkina Faso, or also Senegal, and Joseph Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The civil society is involved on behalf of the people, on behalf of citizens that want to prevent that the democratization process is stopped. Another idea that I would also like to put on the table is that Africa could resist COVID-19 better than other continents. And this can be explained mainly because of the weather. This is a warm continent on the one hand, and on the other hand, most of the population is young and are quite resilient to pandemics. Lastly, in Africa, we have had a long-standing experience in the fight against pandemics like malaria or AIDS, and lastly also cholera. This may explain why African countries have resisted, but in any case, this pandemic could have devastating effects in Africa because we do not have the health infrastructures necessary to fight against this pandemic, because these infrastructures were taken away after some of the policies of the International Monetary Fund that attacked the education and health system. In terms of security, after the conflicts I was talking about, I would like to recall the Kofi Annan report in 1998. He came to the conclusion that in the world there were around 32 conflicts and 20 were taking place in the African continent. Now, Africa, I'm not going to say that it's a paradise, but peace is increasing in Africa. We have the conflict in Mali and South Sudan, and to a certain extent in Ethiopia. But the amount of conflicts has been reduced considerably. This is due to the African military diplomacy. Secondly, this is also due to the strategy of African solutions for African problems. Last, Africans realize that we cannot have development without peace, and vice versa. That's why they tried to solve conflicts in this way. In these 60 years of independence, some important steps forward have been made and some steps backwards. This is why I think that now it's the time for Africans to make an objective balance of the situation, to see where we have made progress and to see where we have gone backwards and why. This is what can make us become a continent for the future. We in Africa show contradictory images. As Sylvie Brunel said, sometimes we talk about chaotic Africa, and there is chaos in Africa, and that's something that we shouldn't overlook. But that's not the only image from Africa. We also can talk about we can also talk about the environment in there are many photographers that go to Africa to make to take pictures of the landscape. This is something that we shouldn't forget. We also talk about emerging Africa, this Africa that is growing at an extraordinary growth rate that I referred to before. At the same time, we must acknowledge that there's still poverty and many problems in the continent. Democratic governments must try to solve these problems. This is a dimension that I would like to add. Thank you very much. Thank you for the clarifications. Now, we are going to move on to the questions. There are some questions related to cinema and some questions of different kinds. I'm going to start with two questions related to cinema. So, what resources could African filmmakers use to tell their story to the world? What can we do so that we perceive Africa not only as a continent where wars are over? How can we tell stories that go beyond poverty? How can we tell other stories? How can we change our collective awareness regarding Africa? This would be the first question. This is a question about the role of creators. I don't know if you want to make any comments about the role of creators in order to change the awareness about Africa so that we show different aspects of Africa and not only the common ones. And then there's also a question about history. Now you have the floor. Maybe it would be useful to change our collective awareness through the cinema. I don't know if you have any comments about this. Well, I can try and tell something. I'm not a specialist in African cinema at all or African films, but I can talk about what I've seen in Burkina. There are many young people that want to tell their stories with their own means. I think that the evolution is already here. We are not only showing poverty. From a artistic perspective, there are many interesting ideas in Burkina. There are creative writing workshops. There are training schools for cinematographers. Those are really important. Cinema Festival, which is a great showcase for African films. Festaco, that's the name. This festival was created to give wings to these creations. There is a training gap and a structural gap, that's true, but there is also a movement of cooperation among African countries in order to provide the means and resources to cover this gap. And so that people that want to tell stories about the past and present of Africa can do it from the point of view of Africans. This is something that is already here, and it has a long-standing history. There's also a question about artists. This is a question for Billy. There's also a question about history. So the question about culture is related somehow. African artists speak about political or ethnic discrimination. So in terms of poetry, music, singing, etc., how can we face this cultural wealth that sometimes is not recognized sufficiently? It is really important. This wealth is really important, and sometimes it has a political relation. I don't know if you want to say something about these cultural aspects of cinema and poetry more specifically.
I will try. I think probably the way that in the past, one thing that sort of happened was one way that those of us who were a bit younger at the time, the one way that we encountered Africa and what it meant was through the poets and writers and filmmakers and musicians and people like that. Okay, and there was a kind of, so I think, yeah, I think it's really important. And I also want to suggest maybe that it's valuable, the work, the previous work, the previous efforts of the creators in the last century through to the present, that it be known, that it not be lost, that it not be discarded, that it not be so restricted in its circulation that it's not there and available for the coming generations to interact with, to explore, to discover, to engage with. okay? Therefore, I find it hopeful when you see projects like the celebration in Italy and Bologna about the conservation of 50 years of Fespacco to collect and to preserve the works of cinema of the founders of Fespacco. I was thinking of Lucie's comment because, in fact, Fespacco and Vespasi and Burkina was central to the Africans, the project of the African cinema, along with Carthage in Tunisia, right? So I think those of us who, those scholars, filmmakers, academics, and others maybe should practically, maybe to, as you do your work, Olivier and others, you write, you publish, you preserve, you convey, you enliven the exchange about these things and the awareness of it. I think we also should maybe in the world try to advocate and make an effort to see that the resources that sometimes come from, they come in the world, they come in the cultural world, they come in the world of the international culture, that efforts are made to support Fespacco and to support Carthage and support efforts like this festival that continue to circulate and to create forums and conditions for people to discover and to speak and to engage with each other. And it provides a forum for, from what I understand, for younger creators to meet and to show their work and to share their work. I think it's a good thing. As in my position, I think that's one of the things I can do. I think certainly it's important, but we should also, as one who's been around a bit, it's very important that the young know what went before. And we're talking about 60 years. It's not such a vast time to understand and to grasp and maybe appreciate, but you should be aware of it and see and discover for yourself, and then collectively as a generation, aren't there useful things there for us, things that give us breath, give us strength to continue. Ignorance doesn't serve us. Not to be aware of what went before, even if it's imperfect, and if it's not exactly what we would like, it doesn't serve you. The flattery of you're new, we're looking for a new thing, it doesn't serve. To learn the lessons of the others who created this thing called African cinema and African culture is central, because if you don't, you're in a position of constantly reinventing the wheel, to cite a cliche. You're making the same thing. They already discovered that the thing can roll. It's less heavy, but don't neglect. And I don't think we do. I don't think anyone is served by not sharing the legacy, the prior efforts and history, and as go as far as we can to share that with the others and to share it with the world, because it's really, really substantial. And I don't go on more because I take too much time. Thank you.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Et il y a une question.
Well, there's a question made by Boniface Mbuyi. This is an invitation to think about an utopia. His question is, could we imagine how Africa would be today if it hadn't suffered colonization and slavery? How could Africa be? This is an exercise of imagining. We can imagine how Africa would be if colonization and slavery hadn't existed. Well, this is a fundamental question. Can you hear me? I was saying that this is a fundamental question that we see in Africanist circles. On the one hand, it seems that Africans tend to reduce as a source of the misfortune. They focus on colonization and slavery, while at the same time in the north, in European colonizing countries mainly, they consider slavery to a certain point and colonization as a process that allowed Africans to be part of the circle of modern nations. I tend to consider slavery and colonization as forms of historical aggression that the African continent suffered. Both slavery and colonization, if they had become process of collaboration and cooperation with the African continent instead, Africa wouldn't be at this current level of conflict and underdevelopment. Slavery allowed Africans to fight each other. This is something that has been conveyed or translated into modern societies. We have these ethnic conflicts. This is something that we shouldn't forget. Colonizers or slave traders armed some peoples against others, and colonizations with this policy of divide and conquer supported some ethnic groups to subjugate others. This cannot be forgotten overnight. This is something that African societies today still remember. So the idea is not to be moralistic about it, but rather to check objectively that both colonization and slavery have destroyed African societies. They have introduced the seed of destruction and self-destruction in African societies. So the idea would be to rehabilitate the history and culture of this continent. Some aspects that have been attacked by external factors, as Lucie said, we see that in a country like France, for instance, a former colonial power, figures like Thomas Sankara are not known. We could talk about many of Kwame Nkrumah or Patrice Lumumba. These historical figures are not known, but not only in France, but in other European colonial powers. I am always between France, Spain, and Italy, and in these countries, people are not aware of the existence of these historical figures, and we should also try to introduce these figures in the history of the continent, like Chaka, for instance. He was a conqueror, like Charlemagne, for instance, and Samori, and Monomotapa in Mozambique, or the Congolese Jean of Arc, Chimpavita. This is something that, well, as we know, history has been written by one side, and now it's the time to introduce these important African political figures in textbooks. Thank you Thank you for your answer. Now, there are several questions. I don't know if we will have enough time for them. I think I'm going to try to summarize. As I said, there are several questions. The distribution of African films in the continent and outside the continent, maybe digital means could help us to get to know African cinema better. We are talking in general terms, but of course there are differences between countries. For instance, in the case of Untitled in London, there are many people working in several festivals. We have the Tangier Festival, we have Staco. We also need to take into account distribution times and language. It would be interesting to make films in native languages. Billy talked about increasing the distribution in order to show people these films. There is another question as well. Just 1 second.
Beaucoup de questions qui reviennent par rapport à ça. C'est pour vraiment.
There are many questions about the place of African cinema in order to show it to the world. What is the place of African cinema and how can we portray African culture through cinema?
De questions générales sur ça.
So this would be a general question, actually, about the distribution and also African languages and the importance of African languages in this sense. I'm sorry, there are many questions and I'm trying to summarize some of them. There are also questions regarding political figures like Sankara, Mbuyi. Well, the political figures that Mbuyi mentioned. How can we make these films be, well, live and experience the African culture? There is another question as well. I'm trying to summarize. I think that this roundtable is also useful in order for people to be aware of these political figures and see theirs and get familiar with the stories. I think that this optimism is necessary. We could have a more global approach. Without focusing on single countries. Of course, there are important figures in each country, but this idea of Pan-Africanism, of portraying the African culture as a whole, that also could be a way to show this cultural diversity. These exchanges can be maybe the right way to talk about African cinema, considering the diaspora as well. Do you think this could be interesting? That's what people are asking. We could talk maybe of African culture in general. Do we talk in the singular or in the plural? How can we create a certain unity? Maybe this is an abstract question. Do you think this would be interesting? How could we create this unity from diversity, taking into account the different perspectives and points of view? Just quickly, before giving the floor to Billy and Lucie, I would say, Olivier, that it is important for African films to be filmed in African languages. This is important because if we want to show these films to an audience that speaks Swahili, Lingala, Fulfulde, or Mosi, among others, it would be logical for this audience that the film is done in these local languages. But at the same time, we shouldn't exclude other trends. At the same time, we should open to the exterior and show these African realities through films in English, French, or German. That on the one hand. On the other hand, I think that in the same order of ideas, films should show African figures that deserve it, like Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Umi Niobe, Thomas Sankara, just to name some modern figures, but also historical figures like Chaka, Monomotapa, and Samori. Through cinema, I think cinema is the best way to make these figures known. So in order to know these historical figures better, we need to use films, and also to make or to disseminate African culture. As Olivier said, there is a certain cultural Pan-Africanism that cannot be denied. African culture, one of its features is that it is a mixture of different values. We could talk about unity within diversity. There is a certain cultural unity that is conveyed through orality, through spirituality, and collectivism. These are common values of African cultures, and at the same time, there is a diversity depending on the area where we live, in the desert, in the savannah, in the jungle, etc. This is a unity in diversity that explains the African continent. Fortunately, in the north, people speak about Africa as a country. Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent with 55 states and 1,200 million inhabitants. It will be by 2050 the most inhabited continent in the world. So people should start taking Africa seriously because we are a demographic power and a cultural power with different areas like the Bantu area in Central and Western Africa, the Ausama Mandinka in Western Africa, the Nilojita in the Horn of Africa, and in the Nile River. So there's a plurality in the African culture, which also explains our survival. We are not only human beings, but also cultural beings.
Merci. Est-ce que vous voulez aussi rebondir? C'est vrai que là,
Gracias. Sí, pido disculpas por
dans ce flow un petit peu d'avoir donné des choses précises et des éléments et des rappels très nécessaires.
Thank you for conveying us these precise elements and for the reminders.
Du cinéma et de la culture.
Maybe Lucie can tell us something about culture and cinema. Maybe Billy.
Lucie.
So if you have anything to add that you think that is important. Well, I can tell you about an experience that I had related to my film, but which is related to my questions. Language, about the language. In my film, well, it was filmed in French. Unfortunately, 80% of the film is in French. And this is something that I asked myself when I was preparing the screenplay, when I was writing it. I was working with Picontin. He speaks French, but he also speaks Oublier, his native tongue. He also speaks other languages from Burkina Faso. For practical reasons, for me, it was impossible to go there. It was impossible to travel with a translator and to have an intermediary. So having someone like that during the filming, that was difficult. So by default, we filmed in French. But I've spoken about this with Bicontin. He has his native tongue, but his poems are written in French. Well, he's kind of disappointed and saddened by it. He says that first he listens in his mother tongue, but then he writes in French. That's why his poems are written in French. And this is something that he doesn't like, and I do not like it either, but we couldn't find another solution. As you know, our film is in a road movie in a certain sense, but unfortunately, this is something that we couldn't solve. But it's an important issue. So my question would be, I didn't find the solution when we were filming. And there's also an anecdote related. When we were filming in 2017, I was in Ouagadougou. There was a conference in a school, in a cinema school. The speaker was in Burkina Faso for the first time. He was really interested in the figure of Sankara. So until Blaise wasn't overthrown, he wasn't willing to go back to Burkina Faso. And he received an award, but he didn't go there to receive this prize. I was the only white person in that conference, and they asked me, "Why are you here?" I was somehow intimidated. I told them I was going to film something about the heritage of Thomas Sankara. I'm going to travel with this poet. And the first thing they asked me is, what's the language you are filming, you are using for filming? And I was shocked. This made me reflect. But unfortunately, we didn't find a solution. But, well, I think it's essential. It's an essential question. Thank you. We have more questions. And well, you can find a lot of information on our website, on the African Film Festival website. There's a question about the Tanzania process. I don't know if we have the time. Billy, do you want to add anything? There is a question about the Tanzania process. Well, this is a specific question for Mbuyi too, about his point of view about the Tanzania process. Well, maybe we can close the debate with your interventions.
I just wanted to say to about the possibilities and the realities of African cinema and films related to Africa being more widely available. I would hesitate to give strictures because I would want to know what is happening at this time and what has happened in the last, say, 10 years in terms of availability, in terms of these new platforms, in terms of those things. I know it's valuable to do, but I would like to know what people are doing and the way that they're thinking about it. I would think that these changing formats and these streaming services that people are being encouraged as this is the way that people are encountering moving images and culture, audiovisual culture, that as is happening here in Portugal, that in African countries and other places where people subscribe and sustain this kind of activity, this is a commercial activity. So maybe the people who are concerned with culture, concerned with those areas, they need to decide how do we gain access to some of the resource and money that's spent on these things? How can that come back to the peoples that are, using this to support activities of the choice of the peoples in that place, or support training, support cinema locally, support cultural life locally. It shouldn't be just passive, we subscribe. It should also do something other. And that's been a decision that has been advocated here in Portugal, where I am now. And that's just one thing. But I would like to know much more. And I would like to remind those that are in the present and can make this kind of creative and imaginative decision, I say it seriously, they should probably be very aware of what preceded, what went before, what were the circumstances and conditions before. That's what I would say.
Ben, merci beaucoup. Donc, on me demande...
If it's not too bureaucratic and vague.
Merci.
If it's not too vague, thank you.
Merci. Alors, on me demande de
Thank you. Just a short question about the Tanzania situation because they are telling us that we need to close the roundtable. I'm going to be quite concise. I'm going to be as concise as possible. I would like to add, as I said before, that we have the problem of immigration, which needs to be shown in the world of cinema. This is a problem that has turned into a disgrace. There are many victims in the sea and on the deserts. This is a phenomenon where we see more the effects than the root causes. This is an important phenomenon that needs to be introduced in films, in the cinema, because the African youth is suffering a lot. These young people need to choose between the Kalashnikov, between that or fleeing to earn their living somewhere else. And then we have also the balance between colonization after 60 years. After everything that has been said in Africa today, we live much better than we lived 100 years ago, but worse than 60 years ago. I do not want to defend colonization at all, because that was a cultural genocide and an economic exploitation. But today, the living conditions are worse than 60 years ago in the continent. Lastly, in the case of Tanzania, Tanzania was the only African country during the mandate of Julius Nyerere that should also be known, a poor man that tried to make a synthesis between African tradition and Western modernity. He introduced Swahili, an African language, as a language not only for the education, but as a language of national unity in Tanzania. This is an exception, a real experience that other African countries should also introduce. That's it, Olivier. Thank you very much. I just wanted to conclude with Mbuyi's comments with this message. We are going to close the roundtable now. Thank you very much for inviting me to moderate. I would like to thank the festival organization and the speakers for the debate. We've heard your different perspectives. Thank you for this debate. And now I'm going to give the floor to Marta for the transition. Personally, I liked how we made this link between cinema and historical figures. I think it's really interesting to have this deep perspective about artistic and historical processes. Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Lucie. And thank you, Mbuyi.
Thank you.
And also, thank
y muchas cosas que digerir de todo lo que
we have many things to think about after your reflections, and with this debate we have made a map of Europe. In Paris. So this is one of the strengths of technology. We have had this global debate that has been followed by the Spanish cultural centers in Equatorial Guinea. Thank you very much for participating so actively through your questions. We also have participants through YouTube Live. Thank you for your question and questions. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to formulate them all. Thank you very much. Tomorrow we will start earlier. Please write down the time. The Palaver Tree session will start at 10:30. We will start with our session on training and industry. We will talk about African cinema and independent cinema, the cinema business in viral times in an interconnected and multi-screen world. We will have Hadidia Digo, Kioma Onyewe, Teresa Hill, and Federico Olivier. Tomorrow at 10:30 in the 17th edition of the Tarifa Tangier African Film. you.